Why don't you? Why don't you accept the offer you got from him? Why don't you accompany your girlfriend? Why don't you act like a cop? Why don't you act your age? Why don't you add a little more flour? Why don't you add it up? Why don't you adjourn to my study? Why don't you admit you don't want anyone else to be happy because you're a sad old fart? Why don't you align with me? Why don't you all do something? Why don't you all just back off? Why don't you all just fade away? Why don't you all lighten up? Why don't you allow me to demonstrate? Why don't you always talk to us like that? Why don't you anchor the implant? Why don't you and Daniel split it? Why don't you and Heifer wise up? Why don't you and I go away this weekend? Why don't you and I go to the prom together? Why don't you and I take a walk? Why don't you and I talk? Why don't you and I try and relax? Why don't you and I try out? Why don't you and me talk? Why don't you answer a question? Why don't you answer my call? Why don't you answer my letters? Why don't you answer the phone, please? Why don't you answer the phone? Why don't you answer when I call you? Why don't you answer when I'm calling you? Why don't you answer? Something bothering you? Why don't you apologize first? Why don't you apply nail polish? Why don't you apply to some other colleges? Why don't you appreciate it? Why don't you appreciate Kirk, who is always so loyal to you? Why don't you arrange for them to meet? Why don't you arrest her now? Why don't you ask a friend? Why don't you ask a travel agency where to go and what to see? Why don't you ask about the final five? Why don't you ask at the gas station? Why don't you ask Bill? He knows computers inside out. Why don't you ask Brian? Why don't you ask for an extension? Why don't you ask for help? Why don't you ask for the day off? Why don't you ask help from Dana? She's an obstetrician. Why don't you ask her about me? Why don't you ask her nurse? Why don't you ask her out if you like her so much? Why don't you ask her out? Why don't you ask her out? You may not like her once you get to know her. Why don't you ask her to dance? Why don't you ask her to marry you? Why don't you ask her to the dance? Why don't you ask her what she is? Why don't you ask her what she wants? Why don't you ask him directly if his concern is with appropriate compensation? Why don't you ask him for his advice? Why don't you ask him for it yourself? Why don't you ask him for it? Why don't you ask him outright if it's true? Why don't you ask him that question? Why don't you ask him to come back? Why don't you ask him what he's doing? Why don't you ask him where he lives when he comes to your house tomorrow? Why don't you ask him yourself? Why don't you ask him, as he is a willing horse? Why don't you ask him? Why don't you ask him? Why don't you ask his advice? Why don't you ask if they'll let you send it from there? Why don't you ask it yourself? Why don't you ask Jane to come with you? Why don't you ask Jane to go to the party? Why don't you ask Jim? Why don't you ask Lou, over in graphics? Why don't you ask me a question? Why don't you ask me for help? Why don't you ask me how I am? Why don't you ask me how I've been, hey? Why don't you ask me if I love him? Why don't you ask me something intelligent? Why don't you ask me something relevant? Why don't you ask me that later? Why don't you ask me that? Why don't you ask me to my face, bitch? Why don't you ask me to walk back again? Why don't you ask me what I'm doing here? Why don't you ask me what I'm thinking of? Why don't you ask me what you really want to know? Why don't you ask me what's in the bag? Why don't you ask Mr. Suzuki? Why don't you ask Mr. Yoon for help? He's well connected. Why don't you ask my mother? Why don't you ask one of them? Why don't you ask Phil? Why don't you ask some help? Why don't you ask somebody for directions? Why don't you ask someone at the station? Why don't you ask someone at the tour desk? Why don't you ask someone else? Why don't you ask someone who was at the party? Why don't you ask that guy? Why don't you ask the father of your unborn child? Why don't you ask the police? Why don't you ask the waitress to bring some water for you? Why don't you ask the woman who has been around? Why don't you ask them over for dinner? Why don't you ask them to help? Why don't you ask them to promise? Why don't you ask what happened? Why don't you ask your mother to get it? Why don't you ask your boss for a raise? Why don't you ask your boyfriend to come along to the party? Why don't you ask your dad some questions? Why don't you ask your dad? Why don't you ask your daddy? Why don't you ask your friend? Why don't you ask your friends? Why don't you ask your little sister to come with us? Why don't you ask your mom? Why don't you ask your pal here? Why don't you ask your parents to adopt a pet if you think they feel lonely? Why don't you ask your parents to go south this weekend? Why don't you ask your people? Why don't you ask your robed friends outside? Why don't you at least ask if it is okay to take photos there, to show good manners? Why don't you back off a second, okay? Why don't you back up, mister? Why don't you badger your father for a new car? Why don't you be a grown-up and come and watch some TV in the fort? TV. Why don't you be a man? Why don't you be a soldier? Why don't you be a thief? Why don't you be a whore? Why don't you be alert always? Why don't you be at home instead of running around on your day off? Why don't you be clever someplace else? Why don't you be honest with me? Why don't you be my guest? Why don't you be nice to her for once? Why don't you be on the level? Why don't you be quiet just once in a while? Why don't you be straight with her? Why don't you be the judge? Why don't you be the man who discovered her? Why don't you be the man? Why don't you beam me out of here? Why don't you beat it? Why don't you become a better man? Why don't you become a cop or something? Why don't you become a killer? Why don't you become a kind kid and help them? Why don't you become a priest? Why don't you become friends with them this semester? Why don't you behave like one, hey? Why don't you behave? Why don't you believe me when you're so afraid of me? Why don't you believe what the president says, Daddy? Why don't you bite them back? Why don't you blame your mother? Why don't you boat it when you go to Japan? Why don't you bob at each other? Why don't you body out your idea? Why don't you boil it anyway? Why don't you book a flight? Why don't you book a room at the hotel? Why don't you both just shut up? Why don't you both let yourselves out? Why don't you both shut up? Why don't you bow to your parents and grandparents on New Year's Day, too? Why don't you break out of yours? Why don't you break up with one of them? Why don't you break up with your girlfriend? Why don't you breathe in the fresh air? Why don't you bribe him? Why don't you bring her in more often? Why don't you bring her to dinner tomorrow night? Why don't you bring it up at the next staff meeting? Why don't you bring lunch from home? Why don't you bring some over? Why don't you bring some to dinner? Why don't you bring them over to our house this evening? Why don't you bring them over to our house this evening? We'll have a little party and look at them. Why don't you bring your better half? Why don't you bring your chair forward? Why don't you bring your wife around to see us sometime? Why don't you brush on your English? Why don't you bury the hatchet with Tom? Why don't you busy yourself somewhere else? Why don't you butt out, mind your own business? Why don't you buy a bottle from the vending machine? Why don't you buy a CD on the way out? Why don't you buy a drink? Why don't you buy a new car? Why don't you buy a new pair of shoes? Why don't you buy a new shirt? Why don't you buy an air conditioner? Why don't you buy another one? Why don't you buy his story? Why don't you buy me a drink first? Why don't you buy me a drink now? Why don't you buy me something? Why don't you buy the land for the future? Why don't you buy your flowers after work? Why don't you buy yourself a wreath? Why don't you buzz off on your broomstick? Why don't you call a repairman? Why don't you call a repairman? Why don't you call customer service? Why don't you call first, and see if there's anything you can do? Why don't you call for a taxi? Why don't you call her back tomorrow morning? Why don't you call her back? Why don't you call her? Why don't you call him and find out? Why don't you call him and see what he says? The sooner, the better, right? Why don't you call him back? Why don't you call him sometime? Why don't you call him? Why don't you call in a few hours? Why don't you call in sick? Why don't you call information? Why don't you call me in 20 years and tell me if you're still upset about this? Why don't you call me this weekend? Why don't you call me tonight at the hotel? Why don't you call me tonight? Why don't you call on Matt on your way back from work and see how he is? Why don't you call the bank and find out? Why don't you call the duty manager? Why don't you call the police? Why don't you call up a few people and ask them? Why don't you call up front, the office? Why don't you care about him? Why don't you care about this? Why don't you carry the ball for a while? Why don't you carry the ball for a while? Why don't you carry the ball for us? Why don't you cash them? I don't know. Why don't you change into something more comfortable? Why don't you change the station? Why don't you change your hairstyle? Why don't you change your life? Why don't you check in one of my saddlebags while I chew on a bale of hay? Why don't you check out the latest in pillow science? Why don't you check the lobby? Why don't you check your wallet just in case? Why don't you check out that movie? Why don't you choose one of ours? Why don't you choose one that interests you the most? Why don't you chop off a foot? Why don't you chuck him out? Why don't you chuck it all out, eh? Why don't you clean a bit? Why don't you clean that up, man? Why don't you clean up a bit? Why don't you clean up the back or something? Why don't you clean your room this weekend to make a fresh new start? Why don't you clean your room when you have nothing else to do? Why don't you clean your room? Why don't you clear off your tabletop first? Why don't you clear up a little around here? Why don't you collect the rents from now on? Why don't you come and see me? Why don't you come along with me and see if you like it? Why don't you come along with me? Why don't you come along with us? Why don't you come along? Why don't you come and I'll help you find something? Why don't you come and see me sometime? Why don't you come and see me? Why don't you come and sing along? Why don't you come around to our place sometime? Why don't you come back to my place? Why don't you come by my room tonight? Why don't you come clean and confess? Why don't you come clean? Why don't you come clean? Why don't you come dancing with me? Why don't you come down and join us? Why don't you come down for the weekend? Why don't you come down more often? Why don't you come down to the gym? Why don't you come driving with us tonight? Why don't you come for dinner? Why don't you come hang out in my dressing room? Why don't you come here and enjoy Halloween with me? Why don't you come here for a visit? Why don't you come here for a while? Why don't you come here more often? Why don't you come in again tomorrow? Why don't you come in and I'll put this in the fridge? Why don't you come in for a sec? Why don't you come in for a while? Why don't you come in here, join the party? Why don't you come in Monday morning at, say, 8 o'clock? 8? Why don't you come in, make yourself comfortable? Why don't you come inside for a while? Why don't you come it? Why don't you come make yourself more comfortable? Why don't you come now? Why don't you come on back and eat your breakfast? Why don't you come on over? Why don't you come on, take a look? Why don't you come out on the road with us? Why don't you come out with me for a drink? Why don't you come over and get some? Why don't you come over and have some turkey with us? Why don't you come over and keep me company tonight while I babysit? Why don't you come over and we can watch it on TV? Why don't you come over for a cup of tea when you have time on your side? Why don't you come over for dinner Monday night? Why don't you come over for dinner? Why don't you come over here and join us? Why don't you come over here tomorrow evening? Why don't you come over on Sunday morning? I'll make some breakfast and we can chew the fat before going out to the movies. Why don't you come over this weekend? Why don't you come over to England in the summer? Why don't you come over to my desk for a while? Why don't you come over to my office? Why don't you come over to my place first? Why don't you come over to my place for supper? Why don't you come over to my place? Why don't you come over tonight? And I'll make you favorite dinner. Why don't you come over? Why don't you come right this way? Why don't you come round for a drink after dinner?